The frontier is not just a battleground of rifles and war parties. It is a crucible where men are tested to the breaking point. In the last episode, Simon Kenton stood on the edge of war, forging his path through bloodshed and shifting alliances. But the frontier has no mercy. Now Kenton is about to endure his greatest trial yet. What happens when a man known for his strength and cunning finds himself stripped of his weapons, his freedom, and perhaps even his life? This is the story of a man who faced the impossible and refused to break. This is the story of Simon Kenton, captured by the Shawnee. September 1778, the Siege of Boonsboro. On September 7th, 1778, a force of 444 Shawnee warriors, led by Blackfish, Blackhoof, and Meluntha, surrounded Boonsboro. British captains Duquesne and Shane accompanied them, demanding the fort's surrender. Boone pretended to negotiate, delaying the Shawnee while preparing defenses. The Shawnee attempted to capture Boone and his officers during a fake treaty signing on September 9th, 1778. Boone's men escaped back inside the fort, and the siege of Boonsboro began. The settlers held out against constant gunfire and attacks, eventually forcing the Shawnee to retreat. Simon Kenton's capture. After the siege ended, Colonel John Bowman ordered Simon Kenton, Alexander Montgomery, and George Rogers Clark to spy on the Shawnee stronghold at Chillicothe. Their mission was to steal Shawnee horses to cripple their mobility. On September 13th, 1778, Kenton, Montgomery, and Clark reached Paint Creek and spotted a small Shawnee village. Kenton heard laughter nearby and decided to investigate alone. He stumbled upon an old Shawnee warrior and a young boy on horseback. Kenton shot and killed both riders, but their horse ran back to the village, alerting the Shawnee. Shawnee warriors quickly pursued him. Boone, Montgomery, and 16 frontiersmen arrived just in time, forcing the Shawnee to retreat. Boone ordered a retreat, but Kenton and Montgomery stayed behind to continue stealing horses. That night, Kenton and Montgomery sneaked into the village and freed 4 horses. A Shawnee sentry spotted them and raised the alarm. Montgomery escaped, but Kenton was hit with a war club and knocked unconscious. The first night of captivity. When Simon Kenton awoke, he was bound hand and foot. His captors wasted no time in stripping him naked, binding him tightly and lashing him to a tree. His body, already battered, became a feast for ants, which crawled over his skin, biting relentlessly. He gritted his teeth as pain spread across his body, refusing to give his tormentors the satisfaction of hearing him cry out. As the night stretched on, the mosquitoes descended, swarming his exposed flesh. Every inch of his skin burned with bites, his muscles cramping from the tight bindings. Exhausted and in agony, he barely slept. His captors laughed and taunted him, throwing scraps of food just out of his reach. But Kenton did not break. He had survived worse, and he would survive this. By morning, he learned Montgomery's fate. His companion had not escaped after all. He had been captured, executed, and scalped. Kenton knew this not because the Shawnee told him, but because they hung Montgomery's scalp by the fire, letting the smoke curl around it like a grim trophy. The sight of it filled Kenton with a cold, silent rage. He knew then that his own death would not come quickly. The captive's journey through Shawnee villages. Chillicothe, the first and second Gauntlet runs. Upon arriving in Chillicothe, Kenton was immediately ordered to run his first gauntlet. Warriors lined up on both sides, wielding clubs, sticks, and switches, waiting for their chance to strike. As soon as he was released, Kenton sprinted forward, trying to evade the worst of the blows, but the Shawnee were relentless. Each strike landed with crushing force, leaving welts and bruises across his body. He barely managed to push forward when a warrior swung a heavy club into his ribs, knocking the wind from his lungs. Staggering, he tried to regain his footing, but another blow caught him in the legs, sending him sprawling to the ground. The crowd erupted in laughter as Kenton struggled to rise, only to be knocked back down by a brutal strike to his back. Gasping for breath, he tried to crawl forward, but the Shawnee warriors kicked him, prodded him with sticks, and struck him repeatedly, making movement nearly impossible. The rules of the gauntlet were clear. If a prisoner failed to reach the end or could not get back up quickly, they had to run it again. Kenton had been too weak to finish, collapsing before reaching the designated endpoint. The Shawnee saw this as failure, and failure meant he had to endure the ordeal once more. So the Shawnee decided to force him to run a second gauntlet, this time making it longer and even more brutal. His previous injuries made it nearly impossible to avoid the blows, and he was knocked to the ground multiple times. The warriors showed no mercy, kicking him and striking him as he tried to crawl forward. By the time he reached safety, his body was battered, and he could barely stand. This second gauntlet in Chillicothe made it clear. His captors intended to break him, no matter how long it took. After the gauntlet, he was tied to a post and beaten, the Shawnee taking turns testing his endurance. That night, he was left bound to the ground, exposed to insects and cold, ensuring he suffered even in his sleep. Piqua, the brutality increases. After Chillicothe, Kenton was taken to Piqua, another major Shawnee village, where the tribe sought additional vengeance. Upon his arrival, he was once again ordered to run a gauntlet, marking his third where he had to endure this torture. The warriors lined up with clubs, burning brands, and axes, making it clear that this would be one of the most grueling runs yet. As soon as he was released, Kenton did his best to dodge the worst of the blows, but his body was already weakened from the previous gauntlet runs. A warrior struck him hard across the shoulder with a tomahawk handle, sending him crashing to the ground. Before he could regain his footing, several warriors surrounded him, kicking him, stomping on his back, and striking him with their weapons. The Shawnee demanded he finish the gauntlet, but Kenton could barely lift himself. Seeing his inability to complete the run, the warriors dragged him forward, taunting and beating him as they pulled him to the council house. Because he failed to finish the gauntlet, the Shawnee forced him to run it again later that day. This time, his legs gave out before he even reached the halfway point, and he was dragged through the remainder of the line, barely conscious. The warriors, laughing at his broken state, took turns beating him with rifle stocks and clubs, testing whether he could endure more suffering. By nightfall, he was left tied to a post, his body swollen and barely able to move. The Shawnee women, seeing him as a trophy, poured scalding water over his wounds, laughing as he writhed in pain. Yet despite the agony, Kenton refused to scream. Wapatamaka, the execution sentence. From Piqua, Kenton was marched to Wapatamaka, where the tribal council would ultimately decide his fate. Upon his arrival, he was once again ordered to run the gauntlet, a brutal test that by now had become routine. This time, however, the Shawnee warriors made it even more severe. Armed with clubs, whips, and even knives, they struck Kenton relentlessly as he staggered forward. Some warriors lashed him with rawhide cords, while others struck him so hard with their weapons that he nearly collapsed before reaching the end. Because he failed to finish the first gauntlet, Kenton was forced to run it again later that day. His body was already weakened, and the second run became an even greater test of endurance. The warriors now aimed their strikes with greater precision, ensuring he felt the full weight of their vengeance. He was tripped multiple times, and whenever he fell, they dragged him back to his feet and forced him forward. By the end, his body was so battered that he barely remained conscious, his vision blurred from exhaustion and pain. As he stumbled toward the finish line, barely able to stand, the Shawnee children joined in, throwing stones and kicking him while the crowd howled with laughter. His skin was torn, his body bruised beyond recognition, and yet he refused to fall entirely. When he finally collapsed at the end, bloodied and gasping for breath, he was dragged to the center of the village for the next phase of his torment. It was here that he was sentenced to death. The warriors prepared a large stake in the center of the village, gathering firewood around it for his burning. Onlookers jeered as the Shawnee painted his entire body black, the traditional sign that a prisoner was marked for death. Just as the final preparations for his execution were being made, a Shawnee woman intervened. Moved by Kenton's endurance, she claimed him as her adopted son, invoking the Shawnee tradition that a warrior could be spared if taken into a family. This decision temporarily halted the execution, though Kenton remained a prisoner. Macachak, the near escape and skull fracture. Upon arriving at Macachak, Kenton was once again forced to run the gauntlet, marking yet another brutal ordeal in his captivity. This gauntlet was particularly vicious, as the warriors had grown increasingly determined to break him. The line of warriors stretched longer than at any previous village, ensuring his torment would last even longer. They struck him with clubs, heavy sticks, and even hatchets as he ran. He attempted to dodge blows where he could, but his body was already weakened from the repeated beatings he had endured. Near the end of the line, he was knocked off his feet by a particularly forceful strike to his ribs. The crowd roared in delight as he struggled to crawl forward, only to be dragged to the center of the village and further beaten. Despite the suffering, Kenton saw an opportunity for escape. Under the cover of darkness, he managed to slip his bonds and dart into the surrounding wilderness. His captors, alerted too late, immediately gave chase. But Kenton was no ordinary prisoner. His speed and agility had always been legendary, and even in his weakened state, he was still faster than most warriors. He outpaced even the swiftest Shawnee runners, maneuvering through the open field between the forests before anyone even knew which direction he had gone. The warriors scrambled in all directions, but Kenton had vanished like a ghost into the trees. Unfortunately, his moment of freedom was short-lived. After hours of running, exhaustion and injury slowed him, allowing his pursuers to close in. He was finally recaptured after an intense struggle, tackled to the ground before he could disappear deeper into the wilderness. His punishment was swift and merciless. He was savagely beaten, and Blue Jacket himself smashed his skull with a war club, leaving him with a severe fracture. For days, he drifted in and out of consciousness, barely able to eat or drink. It seemed as though death would finally claim him, but his captors, now seeing him as a curiosity, delayed his execution once again. Lower Sandusky, the 8th Gauntlet and the breaking point. By the time Simon Kenton reached Lower Sandusky, his body was on the verge of collapse. The Shawnee, still determined to test his endurance, ordered him to run yet another gauntlet, marking his 8th time enduring this ordeal. The line of warriors stretched longer than ever before, their faces filled with fury and anticipation. As he was released, Kenton pushed forward, but his body was failing him. His steps were sluggish, his muscles barely responding after the repeated tortures he had suffered. Unlike before, the warriors had grown more merciless. Some tripped him deliberately, while others struck with enough force to break bones. The warriors took full advantage of his weakness, striking with club handles, spears, and tomahawks. He was tripped multiple times, forcing him to crawl forward, only to be dragged back to his feet and struck down again. By the time he collapsed at the end of the gauntlet, his face was swollen, his body bruised from head to toe, and his breath was shallow. He could barely move, yet somehow, he had survived. But this was not the end. The warriors, though impressed by his endurance, still debated what to do with him next. Some argued that he should be executed immediately, while others saw a different opportunity. Upper Sandusky, the 9th Gauntlet, and the run for his life. At Upper Sandusky, the Shawnee prepared Simon Kenton for what would be his final gauntlet run. This time, Kenton knew his body could take no more punishment. He had one chance, to outrun the warriors before they could hit him. As soon as he was released, he exploded forward with speed and agility, darting between the Shawnee warriors, moving so fast that most barely had time to react before he was already past them. He dodged left, then right, anticipating their swings, twisting his body to avoid direct hits. Even the swiftest warriors struggled to land a single blow on him. By the time he reached the end of the gauntlet, he had taken only a few minor strikes, a feat that left the Shawnee stunned and impressed. Some laughed, shaking their heads in disbelief at the ferocity of his will to survive. This was the moment when many among them realized they could beat him, They could torture him, but they could never truly break him. Simon Girty's intervention, a blood brother's plea. As Kenton lay recovering from his final gauntlet, the Shawnee began discussing his execution. Many warriors still wanted him dead, believing that he had suffered enough and now deserved to be burned at the stake. It was here that Simon Girty appeared. Girty, a former frontiersman who had defected to the British and allied himself with the Shawnee, was also Kenton's sworn blood brother. The two had fought side by side in earlier years before the war had placed them on opposite sides. Seeing Kenton's condition, Girty stepped forward and pleaded for his life. He argued passionately that Kenton was more valuable alive than dead. He convinced the Shawnee that rather than executing him, they should turn him over to the British at Fort Detroit, where Governor Henry Hamilton sought prisoners for intelligence and possible exchanges. Girty's words carried weight, as he had earned the trust of both the Shawnee and the British. His intervention proved to be the difference between life and death for Kenton. The Shawnee agreed, and Kenton, battered and half dead, was transported to Detroit as a British prisoner. Though this spared him from immediate execution, it placed him in the hands of an empire that viewed him as a rebel and a potential traitor. The will to endure. Simon Kenton had faced the unimaginable surviving brutal beatings, 9 gauntlet runs, and a near execution at the stake. Though broken in body, his spirit remained unshaken. Now he found himself in the hands of the British in Detroit. He had been spared from execution but was far from safety. What lay ahead would be yet another battle, one that would test his cunning and resilience in new ways. Would he finally find a path to freedom? Or had the wilderness transformed him into something unrecognizable? Stay tuned for Episode 5, where Simon Kenton must navigate the dangers of British captivity, forge unlikely alliances, and attempt one of the most daring escapes in frontier history. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what comes next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.